Hello, my name is Danielle, and I am the Community Engagement Specialist here at the Turning Point Rape Crisis Center. Today, we have an amazing presentation from our counselor, Irene Avina, and she's going to be talking about a culturally responsive take to serving survivors. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to you.
Here we go. All right, so we're going to be talking about a culturally responsive take to serving survivors. Yes, so my name is Irene Avina. My pronouns are she and her, and I am an LMSW currently under supervision for my clinical license. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about diverse populations in sexual violence. So first, I really wanted to kind of share some stats with you, just the kind of emphasizing the importance of the groups that we're serving. Oftentimes, the diverse populations that we are serving are also underserved populations. This includes women of color, low-income people, undocumented women, persons of disability, the LGBT populations are all disproportionately impacted by sexual assault. And so I've got some stats here. First, I really wanted to share just an overall statistic from the national. So I just wanted to start with like a general statistic. According to the 2010 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, approximately 1 in 5 women in the US reported completed or attempted rape at some point in their lifetime. So that's around 21%, a little over 21%. According to that same survey, an estimated 2 in 5 female victims of rape had a disability at the time of the rape. The 2016 National Institute of Justice Research reported that they found that 56.1% of Native women have experienced sexual violence. The 2015 US Transgender Survey found that 47% of transgender people are sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. According to a study of homeless and marginally housed people, 32% of women, 27% of men, and 38% of transgender persons reported either physical or sexual victimization in the previous year. 92% of racially diverse sample of homeless mothers and had experienced severe physical and or sexual violence at some point in their lives, with 43 reporting sexual abuse in childhood. And so I just really kind of wanted to show you some of these statistics and see that as being categorized in this in any kind of minority diverse population group, the likelihood of you being sexually assaulted just increases. And so all the more reason that we really want to spend time finding ways to better serve all these different groups. And so that's really kind of just the motivation for this presentation. So for some objectives, we're going to understand what implicit bias means and how it may influence our decisions, hopefully. Also understand how one's own culture impacts bias. Learn to recognize some behaviors that may suggest bias or differential treatment. Learn some techniques, tips that help de-bias perceptions and improve interactions. Identify identity trauma-informed, culturally responsive ways to serve survivors. So find culturally responsive ways to serve survivors. Understand cultural barriers that prevent diverse populations from accessing resources. Learn of the significance of historical trauma through a culturally responsive lens. And understand the intersection of identities of survivors belonging to multiple diverse groups. So I just want to share this quote with you. From a trauma-informed perspective, a culture is a two-way process. The survivor's cultural background is important and will impact how services are received. Additionally, the provider's own cultural background will impact how services are provided. Attention to culture individualizes the service and make services reflect the needs of survivors. Cultural sensitivity creates a backdrop of context to carry out trauma-informed services. So not only are we taking time to consider the client's, the survivor's cultural background, but we're also taking a second to reflect on our own cultural background. How does our culture, whatever cultural backgrounds that you may fit into, impact how we provide services? How does that impact our thoughts, our beliefs, and how we serve others? So really taking some time to reflect on our own cultural backgrounds is just as important when taking a culturally responsive take on serving survivors. Okay. What? So before we get into that, I kind of wanted to talk about just different words that or phrases that we've used in the past in terms of like being culturally responsive. The first kind of term that really was kind of coined in was cultural competence, and I'm sure some of you may have heard of that term. And so cultural competence really kind of was coined in like the late 80s, early 90s. Cultural competence is a set of behaviors and attitudes that professionals use to understand their own values and culture, value diversity and cultural difference in their clients, and adapt to the culture of the family or community they're serving. So it's all about working effectively in cross-cultural situations. And so that's kind of like what first kind of was coined for serving others of different cultures. Something that was kind of noted as that term kind of developed was that like there was this kind of emphasis of, well, you know, you're the professional and you know all of these different things, you have all of these different resources readily available to you, and almost kind of an emphasis of, well, since I studied this, I may even know better than the client that I'm serving. And so we really wanted to kind of take that attention away from you're the one that knows best and move to something that kind of centers around the client that you're serving, individualizes instead of generalizing what you may have learned about a specific group, because that can lead, again, to generalization, stereotypes, and could potentially be problematic and harm the people that you're serving. So another term that kind of helped with that was cultural humility. Cultural humility is an other-oriented stance in relation to the aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the client. This is done by putting aside our own beliefs, generalizations, and assumptions about other people and cultures, and instead focus on learning how the individual identifies themselves. Critically assess our own assumptions and values and acknowledge how these factors affect our interactions with people of other cultures. So again, it's really taking the attention off of what you know and what you've learned onto what you can learn from the individual. And this is something, you know, you can even belong to the same cultural group of the client that you're serving. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you can make assumptions about how they may identify themselves and how they interact with their culture, because that in itself is an individual experience. How you interact with your culture very well may differ even from someone who's within that same cultural group. So really kind of, again, taking a stance of how can I learn from the person that I'm serving. And so cultural responsiveness is kind of, again, just another evolution of that. Cultural responsiveness is the ability to learn from and relate respectively with people of your own culture as well as those from other cultures. Responsiveness does not imply that one can be perfect and have attained all the skills and views needed to work with culturally diverse clients. that that may not necessarily, there's always something that you can learn about another individual's experience. And it's really kind of emphasizing that. It assumes one just has the openness to adapt to the cultural needs of those with whom they work with and around. So again, just recognizing that there's always something that you can learn, and kind of coming about it from that mindset. And so I just, again, wanted to kind of clear some of these differences, but at times these terms may be used interchangeably, but there are differences within them. And again, that's why we're kind of taking a culturally responsive take, is because there's obviously so much that you can learn, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of that in this PowerPoint, but trying to get to that mindset of, we are the students and the people we're serving are absolutely the teachers. So what is culture? So we'll just take a second to kind of brainstorm and share your thoughts on what you believe culture is. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep going. Is that okay?
Yeah.
What is culture? Culture is a set of attitudes, values, beliefs, symbols, and behaviors shared by a group of people, but are different for each individual, and is usually communicated from one generation to the next. And so with that being said, we're going to go ahead and do a little exercise, the 5 circles exercise, and think about what are 5 cultural groups that you belong into. Again, part of doing this work is recognizing and understanding your own cultural groups and how that impacts you. And so I'll go ahead and share mine as an example. American and Texan, that is absolutely a cultural group that I fit into. I am an American. I have lived in Texas most of my life. So that, again, there are American culture, especially Texan culture, that is very much unique to that geographical location. Latinx, I am, not only am I American, I'm Mexican American. I identify as being Mexican American, which would make me Latina. I like to use the term Latinx. It's more of a gender neutral term. It is a more inclusive term, and I'm more comfortable using that, which kind of goes into my next cultural group that I identify, is within the LGBTQ. I identify as bi, queer, and I am also femme presenting. So these are some other cultural kind of groups that I fit into. I'm a millennial, and I'm also middle class. And so again, these are all different, unique cultural groups. And even within all of those, that is the kind of combination of all those things that really kind of differ. So like I am a Latinx, and a millennial, and middle class. American would mean I have citizenship as well. So that could be a completely different experience from someone who maybe was undocumented, or maybe is from a different generation. And so even those little not very little, but pretty big, different things that can really make a difference in how an individual kind of interacts within their society. So kind of to give a more descriptive idea of culture is this cultural iceberg that I really enjoy kind of talking about and exploring. There are so many things that we kind of think about on like what defines a culture that are less tangible than the things that you would typically think about, like food, music, things that you can see, what holidays you celebrate, those kinds of things, the way you may dress, those are all things that you can kind of, again, like see. But the less tangible things, as you can see, are so many things that make up most of what a culture is, things like expectations, leadership styles, notions of self, values, attitude towards age, just really kind of things you don't really think about. Concepts of fairness, family, like there's so many things that go into a culture that we really don't take the time to think about. And I think is really important, not just in thinking about other people's, but thinking about your own cultures. How does me being a millennial influence my values, my gender roles, right? Me being in America, living in America, and American, how does that impact my cultural values? All of those things do indeed have an impact and are important that we recognize not only our own, but see that that can very well differ from culture to culture. Individualizing cultural identity. So kind of, again, African Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, Asians, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, Alaska Natives are not homogeneous populations. Instead, the identities of community members may be based on a multitude of factors, right? Including but not limited to their countries, regions, and or tribes of family of origin, how long they've been in the US, if they were not born in this country, and to the extent in which they have assimilated into mainstream or maintained traditional values. So the process of assimilation, how much of that has happened. And that can even vary depending on things like class, can really, again, and I think I've mentioned that in here somewhere. They were raised by immigrant parents or parents who were part of a cultural tradition that was outside of the mainstream. The extent to which they and their parents attempted to assimilate into the mainstream or maintained traditional ways. Their age and the age at which they came to the US, where they attended school if they were immigrants. The extent to which they are currently affiliated with traditional religions and cultural institutions. The extent of which they speak English, if English was not their native language or the native language of their parents, and again, their socioeconomic status. So some potential areas for a cultural bump. Concepts of mental health, healing, help seeking, and wellness belief systems. And again, thinking back on that cultural iceberg, these things absolutely may differ from culture to culture, like what constitutes healing, what constitutes sickness. This can absolutely vary depending on what culture you're from. Sickness is in many ways a socially constructed idea. So just kind of thinking about how that absolutely may impact that. And if we're not cognizant of these things, that can very well lead to a cultural bump. That's really how cultural bumps, when we're not aware of the cultural differences, and that very well may lead to things like even discriminatory practices. Perceptions and explanations of the causes of problems with emotions, mental states, and behavior in children and families. Behavior and coping strategies of family members and their attitudes towards communication and expectations of professional helpers. Fear of formal systems and or retribution, lack of trust due to past experiences, service delivery structure and processes that may be congruent with the community's preferences. Concerns about not being understood or respected, concerns about accessibility, lack of familiarity with services. So again, so many things may, like even just the way that we serve our survivors, the service delivery structure may not necessarily be congruent to those like community preferences, depending on what cultures you have in mind, or may not have even thought about that, how that may differ. So lots of areas, again, where these cultural bumps could happen. And so prejudice and bias. So to talk about prejudice and bias, to think about that, we have to first think about like, how do we learn prejudice? And this isn't something that we are born with. In fact, social scientists believe children begin to acquire prejudice and stereotypes as toddlers. Many studies have shown that as early as age 3, children pick up terms of racial prejudice without really understanding their significance. How are our biases reinforced? Once learned, stereotypes and prejudices resist change, even when evidence fails to support them or points to the contrary. People will embrace anecdotes that reinforce their biases, but disregard experience that contradicts them. The statement, "some of my best friends are," captures this tendency to allow some exceptions without changing our biases. So things like, "some of my best friends are," "well, I've served a certain population and they've said this," those kinds of statements really are anecdotal and just basing off of your experiences that are just further reinforcing what you already believe. How do we perpetuate bias? Bias is perpetuated by conformity within group attitudes and socialization by conformity within group attitudes, and socialization by the culture at large. The fact that white culture is dominant in America may explain why people of color often do not show a strong bias favoring their own ethnic group. So that's something to kind of think about too. You can belong within a cultural group and still have a negative bias towards that cultural group. Something to kind of think about as well. Implicit bias defined. Implicit bias can also be known as hidden bias and or unconscious bias. It's a thought process and association that we hold. It often operates outside of our awareness. So we're not really necessarily actively thinking about these things. It's a preference for a group, and it can be positive or negative. It's based on stereotypes, prejudices, and attitudes we hold. And they tend to develop, again, early in life and strengthen over time. So kind of break it down a little bit more. Attitudes are evaluative feelings that are positive or negative. Stereotypes are traits we associate with the category. Prejudice is our preconceived opinions that is not based on reason or actual experience. And again, I want to reinforce that everyone has implicit bias. This is not necessarily something that any individual or group doesn't have. Like we all have it. So I want to go ahead and share a video about this.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive. and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias.
Okay. So again, just kind of reinforcing those definitions. So how does implicit bias impact our behavior? Scientific research has demonstrated that biases thought to be absent or extinguished remain as mental residue in most of us. Studies show people can be consciously committed to equality and deliberately work to behave without prejudice, yet still possess hidden negative prejudices or stereotypes. A growing number of studies show a link between hidden biases and actual behavior. In other words, hidden biases can reveal themselves in action, especially when a person's efforts to control behavior consciously flags, for instance, under stress, distraction, relaxation even, and competition. These are all ways that we are then kind of our unconscious bias starts coming out, things that we're not necessarily, when we're not actively thinking about these things, they can absolutely come out in our actions. Whether laboratory studies adequately reflect real life situations is not firmly established, but there is growing evidence, according to social scientists, that hidden biases are related to discriminatory behavior in a wide range of human interactions, from hiring and promotions to choices of housing and schools. Hidden biases has emerged as an important clue to the disparity between public opinion as expressed by Americans' creed and social goals and the amount of discrimination that still exists. So basically this explains why, if you were to give a survey and ask people, okay, well, like, how do you feel about this? Do you believe this is something that is okay? And, consciously you'll be like, okay, yeah, definitely not. I don't agree with this, or I agree for equality and freedom and no discrimination, all of these things. But again, that may not necessarily be what you may not necessarily agree with your unconscious beliefs. And so actions are going to be the way that we see that play out. Racism without racist, so kind of what the video was talking about. Implicit bias describes the automatic association people make between groups of people and stereotypes about those groups. Under certain conditions, those automatic associations can influence behavior, making people respond in biased ways, even when they are not explicitly prejudiced. More than 30 years of research in neurology and social and cognitive psychology has shown that people hold implicit bias even in the absence of heartfelt bigotry, simply by paying attention to the social world around them. So you don't have to be a bigot, a racist, in order to be kind of adding to these things, these racist tendencies within racist, sexist, ableist, right? All of these things, we can still inadvertently be adding to those things. Implicit racial bias has given rise to a phenomenon known as racism without racist, which can cause institutions or individuals to act on racial prejudices, even despite good intentions and non-discriminatory policies or standards. So let's just have a little kind of like implicit bias impacting consequences scenario. An advocate who has a cisgender implicit bias interacts with a survivor who is a trans woman. Survivor is uncomfortable and resistant in SANE exam. The advocate misgenders the survivor multiple times after the survivor corrects them. Survivor then feels violated, overwhelmed, and shuts down. An advocate then perceives this as the survivor having an attitude. The result is that the survivor has a low satisfaction with the services, has high dissonance with the interaction, reinforcing beliefs of distrust and misunderstanding from institutions. So this is really kind of a disservice to this survivor who's ultimately been through something pretty traumatic and is coming in for help. So what are some strategies, some debias strategies that we can implement as advocates? The first one would be to take a personal audit of your implicit biases. This can be done through the Harvard Implicit Bias Association test. It's a test that you can take that many people have taken. There's lots of research on this and a lot of categories that you can kind of look through, and it will tell you, whether or not you have more of a bias or implicit and a positive or negative towards certain groups. You can also do this by just noticing the patterns on your social media pages. Things like Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn. Like, who do you follow? Who are you connected with? Who are you getting information from? Make a list of people you spend time with and the cultural groups they fit into. So that same kind of little exercise you did with yourself, like, what are the 5 cultural groups that I fit into? Do that same thing with the people that you surround yourself with. Are they within the same cultural groups that you're into? Chances are they most likely are. They are. That's just kind of how humans are. We gravitate towards people who are like us, like-minded individuals. And in some ways that reinforces our implicit biases. So to actively change that, you would spend time with others who are not within the same cultural groups as you. This can also be done by the content that you take in through books, podcasts, social media, again, music, TV, movies. Who are, like, what directors, producers, right? Are they people of color? Do they belong in different cultural groups? Those kinds of things. There was a study that was done where basically they gave that implicit Harvard the bias test to a group of white college students to see what their implicit biases were towards Black people. And after they had taken the test, they then were randomly assigned to where half of the white students were assigned roommates with another white student, and the other half were assigned roommates to Black students. And at the end of their semester, the white students then took that implicit bias test again, and you saw that the students who were roomed with Black students, the white students who were roomed with Black students, they lowered their implicit bias. So just the fact that they were able to share their lives with someone who was different from them very much impacted their biases. Be mindful during your interactions with others from different cultural groups. Slow down, be intentional, non-judgmental awareness, again, mindfulness. Things like being sure that you're eating, taking care of yourself, really, you're well rested. Because if you're hungry, tired, working too fast, your subconscious very well may make a decision that you don't agree with. So what are some cultural barriers to receiving services? Failure to address the larger cultural context. And this can be done through the fact that there's a deep-seated mistrust of institutions due to a long-standing history for many diverse groups of intergenerational systemic oppression. So again, just the fact that there is a deep distrust, and this is something that is intergenerational. Through generations, there has been a deep distrust of institutions at large. Cultural bound values, even things, again, going back to that cultural iceberg, looking at those things that are less tangible. An example of that is how Westerners can have a more individualistic frame of mind versus many other cultural groups have more of a collectivistic frame of mind, thinking of the group as a whole, not as much emphasis on the individual, but finding harmony, finding ways to think about your collective community. Cultural norms and traditions placed on marriage, fear of greater stigma against their perpetrators, linguistic barriers, limited cross-cultural communication skills, again, the language barriers, lack of knowledge regarding abuse, services, and legal rights, things like fear of deportation, fear of losing children, fear of being outed. Different survivors who identify in the LGBTQ have different comfort levels with being open about their gender identity and sexual orientation. And some may not have come out or openly comfortable with that. So recognizing that that also may be something to take into consideration. Significance of historical trauma. Historical trauma is multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. Immigrant families who have been separated when crossing the border, concerns for immigration status, as lower tolerance and prejudice towards immigrant families. That's an example of one. Forced imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Native Americans and Alaska Natives who have experienced repeated massacres and the forced removal of children to federal and mission boarding and day schools where many experience significant sexual abuse, as well as a long history of colonialization and rape of Native women. These have impacts, of course, on the individuals and the cultures, that you're serving, right? African Americans experience generations of slavery, segregation, and institutionalized racism that has contributed to physical, psychological, physiological, and spiritual trauma. In recent past, attempts to eradicate people with disabilities have included eugenics campaigns, compulsory sterilization, forced psychiatric treatment, and the institutionalization of people with intellectual disabilities. Being mindful of unresolved grief and distrust of majority groups or government institutions, advocates can be more readily able to deliver services to survivors and their families. So just if you're being aware of these kinds of things, that there's a deeply complex history with so many populations and groups where they have not been served, in many ways have been oppressed, have been traumatized by the very institutions that many people believe are there to serve them. So right off the bat, recognizing that that is definitely not the case for many people, and it has not been. So culturally responsive skills include inward awareness, inward self-awareness, being aware of your own culture and values. Being able to self-evaluate and self-critique may lead to improved power balances, advocate-survivor relationships. So being aware of those kinds of things, how you may be, how your different values very well impact the way that you serve. Again, being aware of and working at controlling your own biases and how they affect interactions with others. Knowing your own cultural culture in contrast to other cultures reflected and experienced through communication styles and cultural values can lead to a greater understanding of cultural generalizations without leading to stereotyping, to an increased tolerance of cultural differences. So again, just being aware of all of your own values and how they differ. Respect and emphasis and the emphasis of others. Demonstrate a willingness to learn from others around you. This can be your colleagues, your clients, friends, and respond from a place of genuineness and authenticity. Inquire about culturally accepted ways of coping. If the client identifies specific methods, capitalize on these skills. For example, clients may use prayer, spirituality, meditation, seeking social support, engagement in communal activities, distractions, being strong, and acceptance. All of those are valid ways of coping, and really emphasize that. Acknowledge the real and or perceived consequences of seeking help, emotional expression and coping. Explore for socially and culturally more acceptable means of getting one's needs met in problem situations. So maybe an individual isn't comfortable doing a certain thing. Okay, well, what are things they are comfortable with, and go off of that. Again, going from the idea of that the client that you're serving is a teacher of their life and their reality. So learn from them to better help serve them. The caveat to this point is to be careful that you're not placing the responsibility on clients, friends, colleagues to teach you about their culture. That is not their job in any way. You're not, there's a difference between asking someone to teach you about racism or any ism for that matter, and asking to learn more about their individual experience, right? We're not using this as like a end all be all. I now have become woke because I listened to my coworker talk about what she believes racism is. Like, that's not necessarily, and that's a lot of responsibility that you're, and emotional labor that you're putting on that individual as well. You are a capable, competent person, and you have resources readily available to you. So recognizing that it's nobody's responsibility to teach you these things, but you can be curious and want to learn about that specific individual's experiences. Culturally responsive skills continued. Using effective communication skills across differences. For example, noticing the nonverbal attending norms, eye contact, body language, and physical space during conversation, and how they may vary across cultures. Take note of these things when interacting with others from different cultural groups. Always convey respect and goodwill by dressing appropriately, participating in access rituals, and saying please and thank you. I mean, it sounds, like common sense, but really making sure that you're presenting yourself in a respectful way. So many of the groups that you're serving, again, when looking at the historical trauma, right, when looking at the complex relationship of these institutions that have very well not given them those things, looking at the stereotypes, many of them deem minority groups as incompetent. They are not freely, immediately given respect at times. So respect absolutely needs to be presented. Always ask victims rather than assume what they need. We're not making assumptions here. Even again, if you belong in that cultural group, there may be difference individually. So let's not make any assumptions. We're going to ask. Cultural beliefs and practices relevant to response may become clear as victims describe their needs. By listening to what the victims say they need and then following their lead, responders in essence customize interventions to match victims' life experience and promote their healing. Get comfortable with not knowing, researching, listening, and learning. You're leaning in, so you're not going to know everything. This is, again, what I had said in the beginning. This is just getting you into that mindset of you are a student, right? And as a student, you're really, the expectation is not that you're going to know everything. So leaning into that discomfort, getting comfortable with the fact that it's uncomfortable, can absolutely lead to a deeper, richer connection with clients, making it well worth the effort. Improve cultural literacy. Advocates who are sensitive to cultural diversity seek current knowledge of other cultures, but are careful to avoid stereotyping. So, do your research, get informed about what is currently happening with different cultural groups, but don't make those kinds of assumptions that this is going to be, or generalizations that, okay, now that I know a certain thing about a certain group, that is going to be the end all be all information for every individual that I come into contact with. That's not the case. So intersectionality is a big one and is really so important, when thinking about cultural responsiveness. And so intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So kind of going into that individualizing a person's experiences, all of these different ways that they identify or fall into a cultural group very well may impact the increased risk of being assaulted, of barriers from receiving services, right? We want to be cognizant of all of these things, and intersectionality is the framework in which helps us be cognizant of that. Intersectionality is a framework of conceptualization, a person, group of people, or social problem as affected by several discriminations and disadvantages. It considers people's overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand, right, the complexity of prejudices they face. And so I'm gonna go ahead and share a video.
The call for full equality. Today we hear the call for full equality for women, and distinctly for women of color, from a multiplicity of perspectives. Intersectionality is a term we often hear, but what does it mean? Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in 1989, explains it with a metaphor.
Consider an intersection made up of many roads. The roads are the structures of race, gender identity, class, sexuality, disability, and the traffic running through those roads are the practices and policies that discriminate against people. Now, if an accident happens, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. So if a Black woman is harmed because she is in an intersection, her injury could result from discrimination from any or all directions.
Intersectionality in all discussions of the rights of African American women today is built on the work of previous generations who have always been a part of the fight for full equality. Sojourner Truth escaped slavery in 1827 and became one of the most powerful women's rights activists of her time. She emphasized her identity as both African American and woman in her famous Ain't I a Woman speech at the Women's Convention in 1851. In 1893, Anna Julia Cooper addressed the World Congress of Representative Women, saying, "The white woman could at least plead for her own emancipation. The Black woman, doubly enslaved, could but suffer and struggle and be silent." They demanded recognition of both the femaleness and Blackness of African American women in the struggle for political and social advancement. In 1951, the Sojourners for Truth put a call out to Negro women to convene in Washington, D.C. for a Sojourn for Truth and Justice. 132 women from 14 states responded. During the Sojourners' last Eastern Seaboard Conference, they discussed the organizational tenets of fighting against triple oppression facing working-class Black women of racism, sexism, and classism. Their efforts were a precursor to the Black freedom activism of the Black Power era and the Black feminist movement. named for a raid led by Harriet Tubman, which freed more than 750 slaves. The Combahee River Collective was founded in 1974 by a group of self-identified queer Black feminists. Their Combahee River Collective statement was one of the earliest explorations of the intersection of multiple oppressions to include sexuality. They stated, "Our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable." The words and actions of these leaders continue to contribute to today's discussion around intersectionality, feminism, and civil rights that demand equality and inclusion for all. Hey guys, it's Julesy. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about African American history and culture, go on and hit that like.
Okay. So I loved that kind of the way that they use that cross, that intersection, and how so many different things can cause this crash, and we need to think about it from that individual's perspective, and recognizing that there are very well maybe multiple barriers or discriminatory things depending on their identity, the different identities they identify as. And so, yes, very important in this work of being culturally responsive. And so we're just about done. I just wanted to go ahead and end with a quote. Every community and culture have different perspectives and responses to sexual violence, justice, and healing. Because of this, a core principle of trauma-informed advocacy is that as advocates, we are sensitive to and consider the role of culture in a survivor's lived experience, service needs, and decision-making. Cultural competency is not a finite process. It is more than a lifelong learning process, but an openness to the self-determination of survivors. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Irene. I am so glad that you were able to present this for our viewers because I feel like this topic is so important, especially with it being Black History Month. We want to make sure that we have information and resources and knowledge being spread about how to be culturally aware, culturally responsive when dealing with survivors from different communities and the different diverse experiences that they will face that may be different from you, and how you can serve them and how you can help them instead of harming or hindering their journey to healing. So thank you again for coming and speaking and sharing all of your resources and information with us. Thank you to the viewers for watching. If you like this video, make sure to give it a like, leave a comment down below, and share if you care. And we will see you next Thursday for our next Empowered Education presentation. Bye.